on my good friend as well from Australia, Mr. Ashay. He will come in, and also we have another friend of ours from Australia, as it was said earlier, Urastin Nga, who will be presenting online, but he will do the honors of introducing him at that point. Let's give him a hand as he comes on stage.
So the point there is asset management is not interesting. Asset management has to be made interesting. And how do we tell a story through the asset management plans at the municipal level so those councillors and elected members in the room, those financial planners in the room, and in particular, it's great to have the student fraternity here. When you get out of university and go into the work stream, how do you create a story that makes long-term asset planning really interesting? How do I get my presentation up there? Sorry.
1 second.
At the moment, we are seeing Ruston on the screen. We need to get the slide deck.
Which one is it now?
Almost there.
Yeah, it's fine. Fix the podium. Let me give you this mic instead.
That's fine. Mic testing. Yep. All good? Yep. Now how do I get this to work?
I think it needs to give you access there from the PC. If you're still touching it, it's going to freeze. Still on?
Don't touch, Emmanuel. No. There we go. Which mic do I use? This one or this mic? Okay, we can use either. That's good. All right, so for this session here, we're going to keep it really simple. We're going to make it interactive. There is a little bit of trivia as we go through. But really what we're dealing with from a municipal manager's perspective is when we're delivering services around transportation, around water and sanitation, around active recreation like open space and parks, or facilities and buildings as municipal managers. The challenge we have is within a capped funding, within a restricted budget, how do we deliver what we need to deliver, not just now, but into the future? And how do we create a story around that that is articulate enough to be able to sell the message to the elected members, the politicians, and even the communities? So just as a bit of context, if you look at any South African municipality or a United States municipality or an Australian municipality where Rustin and I come from, what do you think would be the average replacement cost of the assets owned by such entities? The average municipal replacement cost, which is what would it cost us to replace if it got wiped off the planet tonight? What do you think that would be for an average municipality? Sorry? Just an average, one municipality, average. 7 billion? Very close. Anyone else? So the average across the world is about 10 billion. And I'm expressing this in South African rand. Last time I was here, I made the mistake of speaking in US dollars. But in South African rand, about 10 billion And when you look at the international averages of asset consumption, which means these assets are getting consumed or eaten up or degrading, wear and tear as time passes, that's about 200 million per annum for an average municipality of that 10 billion. And when you look at a number like that, 200 million per annum equates to about 25,000 Rand by the time we finish this session of the masterclass, which is like a small park bench or a few bays of footpath or a small pit or a section of pipe that has literally got wiped off the GIS by the time we finish this session. And that rate of asset consumption competes with the available dollars, which is why having a story around asset management matters, because then all those aspects of what Dr. Dino was talking about in terms of systemizing start to make sense, because we are actually measuring and managing that performance. So from a storytelling perspective, what does it look like? And I emphasize on storytelling even for students, because for asset management to be interesting, we have to have a story around what will happen in 10 years' time if we spend more money on maintenance and less on capital. What will happen in 20 years' time if we continue the way we're continuing now in terms of how we maintain our infrastructure, or how much more will it cost us or less will it cost us if we change our practices into the future. So this is the South African infrastructure report card measurement scale, exactly identical to United States, Australia, New Zealand, UK. It's a 5-point scale where E means not fit for purpose. In many countries that might be a 6, and A means world class. In many countries that might be a 0, but it's about the same scale of about 5 points from birth through to the point of unfit for purpose. And some really simple examples, when you look at road infrastructure, it's not just the potholes, but the fact that the pavement has decayed, water has got in, it is degrading substantially, the surfaces look poor when it gets to that end of life phase. You look at curb and gutter, which is meant to channel the water, you can see the difference between a green and a red, and it helps tell a story. What proportion of our assets in my municipality are in that yellow and red or orange and red? That's the story about asset management planning. So these pictures kind of provide the elected members or the community with a view from an asset health perspective of what the current state of the assets looks like. Inside a facility, what does a condition 5 bathroom or a fit out look like compared to a condition 1? A roof of a building. When we do repairs, are we intervening at condition 4 or 5? And what does that look like from our municipal perspective? And is that part of how we make decisions? So asset management starts to become storytelling and transparent. So without spending too much time on that theory, what happens in real life, whether it's a road, whether it's a pipe, whether it's a building or a sidewalk or a water treatment plant or an airport or a bridge, assets will degrade. Assets will degrade by nature of wear and tear or obsolescence, or the fact that a facility or a building or a playground is not up to the current standard. Or we've built a highway in the 1980s or 1990s, but now the transportation industry is putting road trains on the roads, the trucks that carry significantly higher mass, and now our bridges and our roads are not functional because they lack capacity. Not condition, but they lack capacity. Similar with underground pipes. So assets will degrade until they hit what is called the point of inflection. And if I can have your attention here for about 10 seconds, please, because that point of inflection is what causes the rate of consumption that I mentioned before to significantly accelerate where our capacity as municipal governments to replace that infrastructure is far less than the rate at which it is degrading. Our capacity to replace is far less than the rate at which it is degrading. And what then happens is we experience what is typically called an infrastructure gap. A gap between what I need to provide and what I can afford to provide. And the strategic asset management concept is about keeping that gap at the lowest possible level without necessarily spending more money. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. How do I keep that gap at the lowest possible level without necessarily spending more money? It's not about spending more money. So here is what happens, whether it's a municipal government in Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, UK, South Africa, doesn't matter. Based on the level of service, every pipe, pit, road, building will get to a point where our community expectations say we're in a very poor state, that F state. And when it hits that point, we have no choice but to throw what is called capital money, not maintenance, capital. Big dollars, big injection, we're replacing the bridge, we're reconstructing the road, the facility is going through a massive refurb and upgrade. It's reached a point of no return. Chances are, if we had got to it years before it got to that point, we could have probably done it for significantly less. But we didn't have a story that articulated to the politicians why that is a good idea. And if we don't have a story, the only choice is a kidney transplant or a triple bypass surgery, because the asset is now at a point where it is beyond that point of infliction. So the stories are important. We'll get to the stories in a minute. But maintain, renew, upgrade, provide new infrastructure. The asset continues on that life path. But why? Because our maintenance trucks in every municipality around the world, or the contractors, are doing what are called salt and pepper maintenance, pothole patching, gutter cleaning, cleaning the scuppers on the bridges, painting in the buildings, fleet, plant maintenance. That salt and pepper maintenance does not improve the physical health of the asset. It simply keeps the asset on that life cycle path. But here is the classic. The absolute classic is, as the asset wears out, the annual effort, x-axis is time, the annual effort of that salt and pepper maintenance significantly increases. And there comes a point at which throwing more money at maintenance is futile. We're probably better off doing a capital injection to really get that asset back up to the acceptable service level. But again, it's not just one asset we're dealing with. An average municipality is dealing with over 50,000 discrete assets: pipes, building components, plant and equipment, roads and bridges, and they're all somewhere in that green, yellow, or red phase, and they're competing for our scarce dollars. Some need a lot of maintenance, some need a lot of capital, and strategic asset management is about finding that balance. Finding the balance to say, how do I keep the vast majority of my infrastructure above that 4 or that 3, or at a C or a B minus on an average, so I can spend the least amount of money on maintenance and I can reduce the risk of a future infrastructure gap. Sounds really simple in theory, and it's not that hard in practice either. But here's another thing that is really pertinent for South Africa is, if that maintenance is not funded, if we don't fund that maintenance, if that salt and pepper stuff doesn't happen, then chances are our bridges, our pipes, and our roads and our buildings may not even last the lifetime they were designed for. And again, as practitioners, We need those stories because no story, no money. That's the reality of life. Now you have a look at this context from a South African perspective. If I was to ask around the room what the state of the infrastructure in South Africa is based on the report that was done in 2022, A means world class, F means absolutely shot. It is in dire straits. Where do you think South African infrastructure is on that A to F scale? It's a trivia question. Sorry? Dire state? You think it's a F? D? Anyone else? F. The state of assets in South Africa at the 2022 report is a D. Overall. D doesn't mean dire, sorry. D does not mean dire. D means our assets, and please, attention please if you can on this statement. D means South African infrastructure has reached a point of that bottom end of inflection, which means it's time to rise and take charge because the infrastructure gap significantly increases because the assets are eroding at that point. We are in South Africa at that midpoint of the asset life cycle and entering a zone where if we let it go any further, we're going to be in dire straits. So there is still an opportunity to take care. And here is the rest of the detail in terms of the different services. I'll just let you have a quick digestion of that across airports, across roads, across water and sanitation, power, electricity, energy, etc. That report card is not a great report card, but it's a wake-up call. And you look around the world, America, North America is C-. Canada is a C+, Australia is a B-, UK is a C-. But when it gets to an E or an F, we have no choice but to throw more money at it, which removes that opportunity to really target strategic asset management to try and erode that problem. And D also means 15% of our infrastructure, 15 out of 100 bridges, 15 out of 100 roads, 15 out of 100 hospitals are in need of immediate attention. Immediate does not mean right now, today. Immediate means I've got to do something in the next 5 to 10 years, otherwise I'm going to hit that dire strait. Because these are long life infrastructure assets. You can still use them, but they are getting to that point of inflection. So balancing that M-run, maintenance, renewal, upgrade, and new is the classic dilemma. And I won't dwell a lot in the interest of time, but here is what happens. If you can see that screen properly and replace the $ with Rand, I just realized that was one slide I haven't changed. And it's based on the A to F scale or the 1 to 5 scale or the 0 to 6 scale. This is a municipality. It's a real data set out of their asset register. What do you think is the dollar figure for the assets that are in the poor and very poor state? 4, 5, and 6. What does that add up to? Poor and very poor, 4, 5, and 6. That adds up to 60 plus 30 plus 0.01, which is about 90 million. So what that graph is saying from a story perspective is we have $90 million worth of infrastructure in this municipality that is in need of immediate attention. That's a B- municipality because they still have a lot of infrastructure in the good state. Okay? Let's say their annual budget is $20 million per year. Per year, we've got $20 million to fix these assets that are in poor and very poor condition. The obvious scenario is to spend $20 million a year, and over 5 years, it fixes the 100 million. Does that make sense? The 90 million can be eradicated by spending 20 million a year for the next 5 years, problem solved. Except there is a whopping 371 million sitting in the fair condition that is likely to now degrade into the 4 and the 5 as time passes. And that can create a serious infrastructure gap. So here is the trick. That 20 million can be addressed by setting a rule base that says, in my municipality, if a footpath looks like that, I call it poor. It's only got 20% remaining life, but because it belongs to a high criticality, high usage, it's a priority footpath. Our decision is to fix it within the next 2 years. That's a policy statement. A policy statement that says my intervention level for my footpaths in the high priority area, when there's less than 20% life, I will definitely repair it within the next 2 years. When we say that, we can attach some financials to it. So from that 20 million perspective, I've now thrown those assets onto a curve. There's some assets in the red, there's some assets in the green, there's some assets in the yellow, and there's some assets in the orange. It's a B- network. Not a lot in the red, lots and lots in the green. And on the right-hand side, we've got $1,500 or 1,500 Rand every year to fix these assets. A red costs me 1,000, and a yellow only costs me 200. So I could have a number of asset management plans. Scenario A, I'm spending some money on the red, some on the orange, some on the green. I can do 1 red, 2 oranges, and 6 greens every year. But if I spend my money using scenario B, where I spend a lot of money on the greens and less money on the orange, or I could go scenario C, where I spend nothing on the red, lots of money on the greens to stop them from turning into orange. And all of these are plausible strategic scenarios. It's about how we are going to spend the money, but we're going to spend the same amount of money. And Raston will take us through a couple of live examples very shortly of what happens in real life. What you see here is, depending on which scenario we pick, because assets are going to degrade from the 3 to the 4 and the 4 to the 5 over a period of time, what happens is scenario A, the proportion in backlog or red almost doubles, because we're spending a lot more money on the reds, during which time the yellows and the greens are turning red rapidly. Scenario B, we have significantly more amount in the red, because that rate of decline is getting significantly hit, because we're not spending enough money on the greens and the yellows. But in scenario D, spending the same amount of money, exactly the same amount of money, we actually end up with a lot less in the red. And that's the piece of storytelling to say, which asset management plan do I adopt in terms of how I allocate my capital dollars across the 50,000 assets I have, instead of just constantly fixing the worst first. How do I allocate that money on that slippery curve, on that slippery slope, so I end up with the least amount of assets in the red? And that process is called optimization, or as Dr. Emmanuel calls, prioritization matrix. So how do I prioritize using a rule base so I can present the story to my community and my elected members to encourage the practice to say it doesn't matter how little money we've got, but depending on how we spend it, the future could look significantly different. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Raston to show you some live scenarios and some live asset management plans of how municipalities around the world have actually got to a position where it's not about spending more money, but it's about spending what we have significantly more intelligently, so we can actually end up with less amount of reds in the future and reduce that infrastructure gap. Could we share screen with Raston, please? Yes, we can. Raston, we are just about to let you share screen.
All right. Hi everyone. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. The time here is 1:14 in time. But today I'm glad to be presenting this alongside Ashay at Indaba. I can't see you. I can't quite hear you as well.
That's okay.
I can feel the energy in the room. Backlog will increase to $35 million in year 10 if we spend on average $487,000 year on year. Now, this $487,000 is about 0.2% of the total replacement cost of the buildings. Now, the next option here, as Ashay has mentioned to you with all the different scenarios, is now if I want to maintain my target level of service to ensure that we don't have too many rates, not going to D, but at least we are how much that would cost us. So here it's saying rate will need $3.5 million. Percentage wise, that is about 1% and total replacement thing. By doing that, we are actually maintaining the health of the asset at about 70% with very minimal backlog of $4.55 million. Then someone can then come and ask, all right, Raston and Ashay, if I want to ensure that there are no very poor assets, how much do I actually need to achieve that? So that would be our option 3, where it's 0 very poor. And the model tells us that we need about $4.95 million, and that will ensure that the health is being maintained at about 70+%, and there's 0 backlog, means no asset in very poor condition. Now we can always go into the builder here and create additional scenario. Or budget at 5 mil, and what would that do? So if the current spend is about 480,000 and I want to increase it to $5 million year on year, I can just simply do that. Update, save that, and I can just run it straight away, and I'll get a result straight away to know if that particular funding scenario is going to help elevate the healthy asset, or it will cause the asset to deteriorate further. And we know exactly what is in the capital works program as an example. All right, so clicking on this here, for example, in option 3, while waiting for the other one to run, you actually do get, all the different spending here for the buildings, how much we are spending on the fire, on the fit out, on the floor, on the structure, the security, and all the different stuff. So this is just an example for the buildings. Underpinning this, the prioritization rules that enable this will be here. Now, for example, if you look at the floor covering renewal. So that's looking at, renewing the carpet, the timber. The prioritization for this particular municipal is for any asset buildings is tagged as high. So that could be the civic building or the aquatic building or the library. We need to ensure that the intervention will happen at 3.8 at a policy level. So for less critical building, for example, the public toilet or the shed, where it's infrequently visited by patrons, we will let that condition 4.5 before we undertake the renewal. So it's as simple as calibrating this, and you could also have for other asset class, for example, this particular example is a road, where we could look at different treatment, going back to the example that Ashay have shown you, with all different degradation profile segments that you can condition 3, 4, or 5. This would be the prioritization metrics behind the scene for a road, for example. And clicking on one of these here as an example, you could see, we perform an asphalt overlay, for a rural urban. So all these here, rural urban, road class, asset type, the width, these are all the different prioritization metrics, the element within the prioritization metric that drives this treatment here. Okay. Now going back to my increased budget here, as you can see, if I click on this, that's for building again, we can see that by just simply changing the budget, you can see now that the health is significantly improved, number one, and it's slowly diminishing. So what he's saying here is this funding to ensure that there are no backlog for the building portfolio. Okay, and underpinning this again, you'll find that there are lists of degradation profile. And the degradation profile looks like this. So clicking on any one of these, the bridges, we have the things, we have the curbs, just click on one of them. That shows how an asset would degrade, from one state to another state, and how long it would take to move, from good to poor, and this triggered all the different assets here. So that's one that you saw for bridges, and we can have one for open space as well. Yeah, so what he's saying here is, for example, it takes 5 years to go from 0 to 1, and 20 years to go from 1 to 2, and then go from fair. And where do you intervene is dependent on the policy of that municipality to ensure you get the best. All right. So I'm going to hand this back to Ashay and stop sharing. Yep.
Can't see the time, sorry. Can we bring that presentation back on? I've just got one more slide. Sorry?
He likes my face.
Thank you, Rustin. While that presentation is coming on, what Rustin was trying to show there was optimization, which is, he's saying the municipal manager can change the budget and figure out what impact it will have on the future condition of the assets. Or alternatively, you set a target and you say, how much more money do I need to achieve that target of not letting my assets drop below a 3.5 or a 4, which is a D or a E? Or how do I split my funding between high criticality roads and low criticality roads, or high criticality buildings and low criticality buildings? They're all scenarios. And scenarios is what drives the stories. Can you flick one more slide, please? I can't use the pointer. Hello? Just click it. I've only got one slide. The down arrow. Yeah. Oh, too much. That's a really simple example of what is called an asset management plan on a page for a small municipality, about 15,000 residents. But you can see here on the left-hand side, and we've had these conversations, Danny, last time when I was down here, is the power of strategic asset management is in the simplicity, not in complex 400-page reports or asset plans that sit on a shelf. Anyone in the room here that would have done the NAMS course for professional certificate in asset management, at the end of that course, you end up writing an asset management plan. And what we are doing is encouraging the younger fraternity to make these plans simpler, because engineers and accountants, we've complicated these plans too much for the simple layperson to read and make sense out of them. What this is really is an asset management plan on a page as an example. And what this municipality has done is given a really high-level overview of their asset stock. We've got about 280 million of transport assets. We've got 130 million of open space assets, etc. That's a snapshot. In the middle here, like Rastan was showing, is the asset health. What proportion of my stormwater is in very good versus very poor? And remember, this is a consistent standard, the very good to the very poor, with using the Institute of Engineers coding system. It's not hard to get that into a consistent framework through your engineering consultancies. But what is the game changer is this here. And that game changer is saying, how much money do we need to spend on maintenance and capital every year for the next 10 years to keep my asset health above a certain level? Now, this bar chart here isn't just last year plus or minus 5%. It is not the accounting depreciation. It is not a number that's just been created through some 5-year sort of horizon. It is based on 10, 15, 20, 30 scenarios of spending the money differently and checking what the outcome will be. And then what gets locked in is the long-term asset plan, and that long-term asset plan then informs the financial plan, not the other way around. And that has been the biggest shift internationally in the asset management industry. And Dr. Emmanuel and Danny are both kind enough to say Australia is significantly ahead in this game. And I think one of the reasons we are ahead in the scenario planning game, and one of the reasons why the United States is so interested in this concept, and now South Africa is interested in this concept. What happened in Australia in the 80s is we had massive infrastructure, but a very small tax base. 20 million residents back then, about $3 or $4 million, 3 or 4 million high tax-paying entities. And what that means is we had to do more and more with less and less. And when you have to do more and more with less and less, the concept of strategic asset management comes in, because you're not fixing the worst first. You're trying to figure out what will happen if I treat the yellows and the oranges before they turn red, or what happens between high priority and low priority, or how much minimum more funding do I need to make sure that I don't end up with that D- or E+ rating over the next 10 years. And that led to that practice of strategic asset management. So in Australia, in every municipality, every 4 years after the council elections, or the elected member have to be taken through an induction process on asset management. Deliberative engagement with the community is now legislated, which means before we lock in the next 10-year financial plan, every 4 years, the scenarios have to be deliberated with the community. A room like this, with about 200 panel members, will deliberate and run live scenarios in the civic chambers to test where the funding allocation ought to happen. And that's called balancing the budget. Accounting is regulated, which means every year the audit office will check and test for controls on whether the accounting depreciation is also based on the life cycle of the assets or not. Is the remaining life coming from the health of the assets as opposed to just the age? So a lot of regulation is there around the accounting depreciation. So when that happens, there is a lot of discipline around the asset management planning process. But my hope is the same, like Emmanuel's, which is, it took us 25 years in Australia to get to the position that we're in. It's taken Canada about 12. They've halved it. The hope is it'll take the United States about 7 to 10, and South Africa about 5, if we do it really well. And that's where the student fraternity becomes important, because you guys are the champions of the change. Because you're not carrying baggages, you don't have historic norm. You have the ability to tell the stories in a new format, and stories that inform both finance, engineering, political, and economic value adding. And your asset management plans are not sitting on a shelf, but they're live. And they are a means to actually inculcate better practice. And the end game is to keep that proportion in red as less as possible, so we have less backlogs, less reactive maintenance, and less need for reserve funding into the future. And on that note, I have stuck with time, and I will hand the microphone back to you, Dr. Emmanuel.